The night Vivian Holloway was supposed to change the business world forever became the night someone tried to erase her from it entirely. The lights died first. Then the screaming started. And while trained security guards scrambled for their radios and executives in $1,000 suits ran for the exits, nobody, not one single person, thought to look at the maintenance worker standing quietly in the corner. That was their mistake, because Mason Reid wasn't just a maintenance worker. He was something the people in that building couldn't afford to understand, until the moment they desperately needed him. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The building had 42 floors, and Mason Reid knew every single one of them. Not in the way the executives knew it, not from corner offices or glass-walled conference rooms where city lights looked like something worth bragging about. He knew it the way a man knows a place when nobody's watching him. The way you learn things when people look past you like your furniture. He knew which elevator on the east side ran 3 seconds slow. He knew the fire door on the 28th floor didn't fully seal in cold weather, leaving a thin draft that smelled faintly of exhaust from the parking structure below. He knew that the security camera covering the northeast stairwell between floors 31 and 33 had a 9-second blind spot every time it completed its rotation cycle. Something he'd noticed on a Tuesday afternoon 6 weeks ago and filed quietly in the back of his mind without telling anyone. Old habits. Mason crouched under a utility sink on the 14th floor, replacing a corroded connector on a water line that maintenance had ignored for 3 months. His toolbox was open beside him on a piece of cardboard. His work pants had a stain on the left knee from a grease job he'd done that morning on the freight elevator. His hands were rough, and he hadn't shaved in 4 days. And none of that bothered him even slightly. He was good at not being bothered by things. His phone buzzed against his hip. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. Emma. Dad? Did you remember my recital is Thursday, not Friday? He smiled. The kind of smile that only happens when nobody's looking, when there's no performance behind it. He typed back with his thumb, still crouched under the sink. Mason. I remembered. Already asked Garcia to swap my Thursday shift. Emma, you better not miss it again. Mason, I won't. Emma, you said that last time. Mason, I know, I won't. There was a pause, then a single emoji, a small yellow face with its eyes narrowed. He didn't know what it was supposed to mean exactly, but with Emma, suspicion and affection usually looked about the same. She was 11, and she'd already figured out most of the things adults spent decades pretending weren't true. He put the phone away and went back to the connector. 2 floors above him and 38 floors below the penthouse, a different world was preparing for its biggest night. Vivian Holloway had been awake since 4:30 that morning. Not because of anxiety. She didn't do anxiety, or at least that's what she told herself, and she'd said it often enough that it had become mostly true. She'd been awake because the Meridian deal required her personal attention on 7 separate documents, and her legal team had flagged a discrepancy in one of the Pacific acquisition clauses that needed to be resolved before the 7 p.m. announcement. She stood at the window of her 39th floor office in a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, coffee in hand, watching the city move 40 stories below. Chicago in November had that particular quality of gray that made everything look like it was already in the past. She didn't mind it. She'd grown up with nothing in this city. Gray felt familiar. Her assistant, Presley, knocked twice and pushed the door open. Legals resolved the Pacific Clause. Marcus signed off 20 minutes ago. Tell Marcus that signing off at 6:45 a.m. is not the victory lap he thinks it is. It should have been done 2 days ago. I'll find a gentler way to phrase that. Don't. Vivian turned from the window. He has a law degree and a $2 million salary. He can handle honest feedback. Presley nodded and made a note, and Vivian noticed, not for the first time, that Presley always wrote things down even when she didn't need to, just to have something to do with her hands when the conversation made her nervous. It was a tell. Vivian cataloged things like that, people's tells, their habits, the small gaps between what they said and what their bodies were doing while they said it. That awareness had made her a billionaire by 41. It had also made her genuinely difficult to be around, which she understood and mostly accepted. What's the status on the security sweep? She asked. Crawford's team completed it an hour ago. All clear. They'll have 8 personnel on site tonight, plus the building's own contracted security through the evening. 8. She said the number the way someone might say 4 when they'd asked for 8. Plus the buildings. I heard you. She set down her coffee. Fine. Make sure Crawford knows I want 2 people specifically on the server room on 37. The system that's running the live presentation connects through there. If anything disrupts that room, the entire announcement goes dark. I'll relay that. And Presley. The assistant paused at the door. Who's doing maintenance tonight? I had a note last week about a water issue on 14. Presley checked her tablet. Contracted crew, 1 technician, Mason Reid. He's been the regular on this building for about 8 months. Vivian nodded and was already looking back at her documents before Presley finished the name. Mason finished the waterline repair a little after noon. He ate lunch in the maintenance corridor on the 2nd floor, sitting on an overturned bucket with a turkey sandwich he'd packed that morning. He read 3 pages of a novel Emma had recommended, didn't fully understand what was happening in the plot, and decided he'd ask her to explain it when he got home. He thought about Thursday, the recital, the way Emma's jaw got tight when she was nervous, something she'd inherited from him, though neither of them had ever said that out loud. He thought about the last recital, the one he'd missed because a client emergency had pulled him across town, and he told himself it was unavoidable, which was true, but wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that some part of him still operated like a man who believed that someone else's emergency always had to take priority. That had been trained into him at a level that went deeper than habit. He was working on it. 3 years ago, he'd walked away from the life that built those instincts. Before Chicago, before maintenance contracts and apartment leases and school pickup schedules, he'd spent 11 years in special forces, first in selection, then in the field, then in the kind of positions that didn't have official names and didn't appear on any discharge paperwork worth showing at a job interview. He'd operated in places most people only saw on news broadcasts, and even then only when something had already gone badly wrong. He didn't talk about it. Not with coworkers, not with his neighbors, not with the other parents at Emma's school who occasionally tried to make conversation about what he did before Chicago. Private maintenance, he'd say, meaning now. And that was all anyone got. He had his reasons. The simplest one was Emma. He'd promised her a quiet life. She deserved a father who wasn't a story, who wasn't a reputation or a risk, just a man who showed up with a turkey sandwich and read the books she recommended even when he didn't understand them. He put the novel away and went back to work. By 6 p.m., the 40th floor was transformed. What had been a conference space that morning had become something closer to a stage set. Modular furniture arranged in deliberate groupings, catering stations along the north wall, a presentation screen stretching across 20 feet of the south end. Holloway Corporation's colors were everywhere, the deep navy and gold that the marketing department had quietly made synonymous with Vivian herself over the past decade. 300 guests were expected. Media, investors, regulatory officials, corporate partners. The kind of room where every handshake was a calculation and every smile was working towards something. Vivian moved through it with her chief of staff, Daniel Cho, making adjustments that her team had stopped arguing with years ago. A floral arrangement moved 18 inches to the right, a microphone height adjusted. A particular investor she didn't fully trust placed on a guest list that positioned him in a corner of the room where he'd have good sight lines to the presentation, but poor access to her. Marcus is downstairs, Daniel said, matching her pace. He wants to review the Pacific Clause one more time before the announcement. He had all day. He's anxious. He can be anxious quietly. I need him sharp, not soothed. She stopped near the window, looking toward the elevator bank. Where's Crawford? Security room on 16. He's running the final check. Tell him I want a call at 6:30. Not a message. A call. Daniel nodded and stepped aside, already with his phone out. Vivian looked around the room for a moment. This room that represented 6 years of strategy and sacrifice and the kind of decisions that kept her awake at 3 a.m., not from doubt, but from the sheer weight of consequence. The Meridian expansion would reposition her company across 4 new markets. It would be the largest deal in Holloway Corporation's 20-year history. A woman in catering passed behind her, adjusting glasses on a table. A building engineer walked a slow circuit near the far wall, checking something on a clipboard. She noticed him briefly, the worn work pants, the toolbox, the way he moved like a man who didn't need to announce himself to feel comfortable in a space. She looked away. Mason had been called up to 40 at 5:15 to check on an HVAC irregularity that one of the event staff had flagged. He found the issue, a control panel that needed a manual reset after the system had been overridden by the event team's climate preferences, and fixed it in 11 minutes. He should have left. Instead, he stayed near the periphery, partly because he'd noticed, while he was at the HVAC panel, that the emergency lighting conduit on the north wall had a junction box that looked like it had been tampered with. Not damaged, not coincidentally loose, but deliberately interfered with in the way that someone who wanted to create a problem later would interfere with something. He crouched beside it, opened it quietly, and looked inside. The primary and secondary emergency lighting circuits had been manually bridged in a way that would cause them both to fail simultaneously, rather than one serving as a backup to the other. It was elegant, in a disturbing sort of way. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. He thought about reporting it. He thought about Crawford's security team. He thought about the fact that someone on this floor, before this event, had done this intentionally. He closed the junction box and stood up slowly and looked around the room with different eyes. Not a maintenance worker's eyes. The other ones. The ones he'd spent 3 years trying to retire. He identified the exits. 4 plus 2 he'd repurpose if necessary. He tracked the positions of the security personnel he could see. 3 visible, which meant at least 2 more somewhere he couldn't see, and likely a command point near the elevator lobby. He noted the guest arrival pattern, the catering traffic, the server room access point through the door on the east wall that someone had left propped open with a rubber wedge. That door shouldn't be propped open. He walked toward it casually, picked up the wedge, put it in his pocket, and let the door close behind him. Then he checked the hallway and moved quietly toward the service stairwell, thinking, someone had set this floor up to go dark. The question was when and why, and what happened to 300 people, including the CEO, whose name was on this building's contract, when the lights went out. He called Emma at 6:20 from the stairwell. "Hey, trouble," he said. "Dad, that's not what you call your daughter." It is when she texts me the suspicious emoji. I wasn't being suspicious, I was being accurate, based on the data. He laughed, actual and short. "How's the song coming?" A pause. "It's fine. Ms. Okafor says my left hand is still rushing in the 3rd section. Is she right?" "Maybe." "Then she's helping you." "I know." Another pause. "Are you working late?" He watched the stairwell door. Down the hall, he could hear the sound of voices rising as guests began to arrive on 40. "I might be a little late tonight, Em, but I'll be home, and I'll be there Thursday. I promise." "You can't just promise. I know what I can promise. This is one of them." He kept his voice even. "You eat already?" "Mrs. Garza made soup." "Thank her for me." "You can thank her yourself when you get home at a normal time." "Fair point. Go practice your left hand." "Bossy," she said, and hung up. He held the phone for a moment and looked at nothing. Then he put it in his pocket and went back out onto the 40th floor to figure out how bad this was going to get. The event started at 7. By 7:40, Mason had identified 2 things that made his stomach settle into the particular cold stillness he recognized from rooms and countries most people at this party had never been to. The first was a man near the catering station who hadn't touched his food or drink in 30 minutes, and whose eyes moved in a pattern that had nothing to do with admiring the view or finding a conversation. His gaze tracked Vivian Holloway's position every 40 seconds, with the mechanical consistency of someone running an operation, not attending a party. The second was that 3 of Crawford's security team had quietly disappeared from their positions in the last 20 minutes, and the ones who remained had the posture of men waiting to be told something was wrong, rather than men actively preventing it. Mason stayed near the east wall. He watched Vivian Holloway move through the room, confident, contained, shaking hands with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing this for decades. She was good at it. She made it look effortless in the way that only comes from enormous effort. She had no idea. At 7:53, the lights went out. Not gradually, not flickering, all of them, simultaneously. Overhead, accent, exit signs. Even the screens went dark. And then, in the sudden black of a room full of 300 people who still didn't understand what was happening, Mason Reid heard the stairwell doors on both ends of the floor open at exactly the same time. He was already moving before the screaming started. The screaming lasted maybe 4 seconds before Mason's brain filtered it out. Not because it didn't matter, because it did, and that was exactly why he couldn't afford to let it occupy the part of his mind that needed to stay clear. Panic was contagious, and contagion spread fastest in dark rooms full of people who had no framework for what was happening to them. 300 guests who had walked in here 2 hours ago expecting champagne and a press announcement were now stumbling into each other in complete blackness, and their noise and movement would do half the intruder's work for them. He counted the sounds. Stairwell doors, both ends of the floor, timed within a second of each other, which meant coordinated entry, which meant radio communication, which meant at least one command point that wasn't inside the room. The footsteps coming through those doors were even and controlled, not urgent, because people who've trained for this don't rush when the environment has already done their first job. The guests near the windows were using their phone screens now, casting irregular patches of pale light across the room. Enough to navigate by. Enough to see each other's faces, which were various shades of confused and frightened and not yet fully understanding. Vivian was somewhere in the center of the room. He'd tracked her position at 7:52, 1 minute before the lights went out, because old habits had been running underneath his surface behavior all evening like a secondary operating system he'd never fully managed to shut down. She'd been standing near the presentation screen, speaking with a man in a gray suit whose name Mason didn't know. Investor, probably. The handshake had lasted 2.5 seconds, which in Vivian Holloway's language apparently meant she respected him but didn't need him. He moved towards center now, low and quiet along the north wall, using the irregular phone screen light to navigate while staying out of it himself. Someone grabbed his arm. Sir, which way is the exit? A woman, 50s, event lanyard, heels that were going to be a problem. He kept moving and pulled her with him by the elbow. North stairwell, he said quietly. Stay close to the wall. Don't run. What is happening? Is this power outage, he said, which was a lie. But it was the lie most likely to keep her breathing evenly for the next 60 seconds. This way. He handed her off to a catering staff member near the wall, young man, 20s, keeping his head, which Mason noted with something close to approval, and kept moving. He found Vivian by sound more than sight. Her voice was low and sharp, cutting through the noise of the room with the kind of authority that didn't come from shouting. Crawford, come in. A pause. Static. Daniel, where are you? Daniel! He came up beside her from the left. She sensed him before she saw him and flinched hard, her elbow coming up in a reflex that was actually pretty fast for someone who hadn't been trained. Easy, he said. It's maintenance. Mason Reid, 14th floor. She put her phone light on his face. He let her. The maintenance worker. Her voice had something in it that wasn't quite relief, but was working in that direction. We need to move you off this floor. My security team. 3 of them are gone. The ones that are left are positioned wrong. He said it flat, not unkind, just fast. Someone cut your emergency lighting circuits before the event started, both primary and secondary at the same junction. This wasn't a power failure. She stared at him. In the phone's upward light, her face was all angles and controlled tension, and he could see her processing what he'd said with a speed that he recognized. Not panicking, not denying, just absorbing and recalculating. He hadn't expected that. Most people in his experience took longer. How do you know that? She asked. I found the tampered junction box at 5:30. I should have reported it immediately. I didn't move fast enough on that. You're telling me this now? Because now is when it matters. We can do the debrief later. He glanced toward the south stairwell, where a flashlight beam was moving wrong, too deliberate, too sweeping, clearing a room rather than looking for a light source. We have maybe 90 seconds before they get to this part of the floor. Is there anyone specific you need to bring with you right now? She didn't hesitate. Daniel Cho, my chief of staff. He was near the east wall. Anyone else? No. Then after a beat. The server room on 37. The presentation system runs through it. If they get into that room, one thing at a time. He put a hand lightly on her arm to start her moving and felt her resist for exactly 1 second before she matched his pace. That 1 second told him something about her. That she didn't move for anyone by reflex. That compliance for her was always a choice. He filed that away. "You have a weapon?" she asked, low. "No." "Great," she said, in a tone that meant the opposite. "I don't need one yet." She glanced at him sideways and didn't say anything, which meant she either believed him or was too smart to argue with a man who was currently the only person between her and whatever was sweeping that flashlight beam across her $40,000 event. And Gits, they found Daniel Cho near the east wall, exactly where Vivian had said, crouched beside an overturned drinks table with 2 other people. A young woman Mason didn't recognize, and Marcus Webb, Holloway Corporation's chief legal counsel, who was holding his phone like it was a weapon and breathing through his mouth. "Vivian, thank God," Daniel started. "Are you hurt?" No, what's happening? I can't reach Crawford. I can't reach anyone on security." "We're moving," Vivian said. "Get up." Marcus Webb looked at Mason. "Who is this?" "He works here," Vivian said, which was accurate and not particularly illuminating. "He's maintenance," Marcus said, making it sound like a problem. Mason looked at him for 1 flat second. "You can stay here if you want." Marcus Webb got up. The young woman beside Daniel was one of Vivian's communications staff, Presley, the assistant, who Mason recognized from earlier in the day and who was keeping herself together better than Marcus by a significant margin. She had her shoes off already, which was practical. She'd made the calculation about the heels faster than Mason would have expected. "Service corridor," Mason said. "Single file. Stay quiet." He moved them to the east wall where the maintenance corridor ran parallel to the main floor, accessible through an unmarked door that sat between a storage closet and an HVAC unit. He'd used it that afternoon. He knew it connected to a secondary stairwell that the building's public blueprints didn't clearly indicate. Not hidden, just not obvious. The kind of thing you only knew if you'd spent 8 months learning a building from the inside out. He got the door open and held it. "Move." They filed through. Vivian last because she waited to make sure her people were through first, which Mason noticed and said nothing about. He pulled the door shut behind them. The corridor was narrow and smelled like ductwork and old concrete, lit by a single emergency strip near the ceiling that was on a separate circuit from the main floor, one that hadn't been tampered with because whoever had planned this hadn't known about it. Small advantage, he'd take it. "There's a stairwell at the end of this corridor," he said, keeping his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry. "It comes out on 36. From there we can get to 37, Vivian said. "We need to go to 37. The server room. If they access that room, they don't just cut the presentation. They can access 6 months of confidential acquisition data. The Meridian files, the Pacific agreements, the regulatory submissions. Everything." She looked at him steadily. "That's not a business inconvenience. That's a demolition." He thought about the man he'd seen near the catering station, the 40-second tracking pattern, the professional stillness of someone running a timeline. "They're not here to rob you," he said. She held his gaze. "No, they're not. Someone told them exactly where your server room was. Exactly when your security would be occupied with event logistics. Exactly how your emergency circuits were wired. Yes. That means someone inside your organization." She didn't look away. "I know." Marcus Webb, behind her, made a sound. Not quite a word. More like the sound a man makes when something he's been not thinking about suddenly gets said out loud. Vivian turned to look at him. It was a brief look. Almost nothing. But Mason watched her face, and he watched Marcus Webb's face, and something passed between those 2 looks that he couldn't fully read yet, but that registered in the part of his brain that had spent 11 years reading things that lived in the space between what people said and what they were actually doing. "We go to 37, Mason said, "but we're quiet about it. We don't know who's watching the stairwells." And he went first. The stairwell was dim, but not dark. The backup lighting here worked, a dull orange glow from fixtures near the floor. He moved down the stairs with one hand on the rail and his other arm slightly out, the way you move when you're ready to change direction fast. Behind him he could hear the group. Daniel's quiet breathing, Presley's socked feet on concrete stairs, Marcus trying to make less noise than he was making, Vivian completely silent. He stopped at the 38th floor landing and listened. Somewhere above them, maybe 2 floors up, he could hear movement in the stairwell. More than one person. Moving down. He held up a fist without turning around. Everybody stopped. The footsteps above descended to 39 and paused. There was a murmur. Radio traffic, too distant to make out words, just the texture of coordinated communication. Then the footsteps moved again, going back up instead of continuing down. Mason released a slow breath and kept moving. They reached 36 without contact. He opened the stairwell door a crack and looked both ways down the corridor. Empty. The regular floor lighting was on here. The power disruption seemed to be isolated to 40, which was consistent with someone who wanted the chaos contained to a specific area for a specific window of time. He thought about that. Contained chaos on 40, a discrete team moving through the dark, and the server room 1 floor up, which was probably the actual objective. The noise on 40 was a wrapper. "Stay here," he said to the group. "All of you." "Where are you?" Daniel started. 30 seconds. He looked at Vivian. "Don't open this door for anyone but me." She nodded once. He went. He took the stairs back up to 37 at a pace that someone who didn't know him would have called reckless. He knew it was calibrated. There's a difference. On the landing, he stopped and listened again, and this time he could hear what he'd suspected. Voices on the other side of the door. One of them giving instructions. One of them confirming. The server room was down the corridor, 30 feet to the left. He opened the door quietly and slipped through. 2 men in the corridor, black tactical clothing, no visible insignia, one with a flashlight and one watching the stairwell from the other end. The one watching the stairwell was turned away from Mason, which gave him roughly 3 seconds before the one with the flashlight looked in his direction. He didn't think about it. Thinking was for situations where you had time. He crossed the corridor in 4 steps and put the flashlight man down with a controlled technique that caused maximum disorientation and minimum permanent damage, because Mason Reid had learned, in rooms nobody talks about, that there's almost always a way to stop someone without destroying them, and that the discipline to find that way is what separates certain kinds of soldiers from others. The second man turned at the sound and reached for something at his belt. Mason was already there. 12 seconds. Both men on the floor, breathing, unhurt in any lasting way, wrists secured with the zip ties he'd had in his toolbox since mid-afternoon. Not because he'd known this was coming exactly, but because the junction box had told him something was off, and he'd started quietly preparing for off in the way that old training prepared you for. He checked the server room door. Locked. Good. Whoever they'd sent up here hadn't gotten through yet. He took the radio from the flashlight man's belt and listened. A voice. Calm. Authoritative. The voice of someone in a command position. Confirm status on 37. Holloway's been moved off 40. Find her. A second voice. North stairwell team is sweeping 39-38. No contact. She doesn't leave the building. And I want Webb. Webb specifically. Mason pressed his back against the wall and ran that last part again in his mind. Webb specifically. He went back down to 36. Vivian opened the door for him before he finished knocking. She'd been right there, which meant she'd been ready to move regardless of what he said, and he adjusted his read of her accordingly. She wasn't someone who waited passively. She waited actively, which was different, and in this situation was actually useful. "You were gone 45 seconds, she said. "I know. There were 2 on 37. They haven't breached the server room." He paused. "I took a radio." He held it up. Daniel and Presley looked at it. Marcus looked at something else, which was the wall, specifically the middle distance of the wall, with the particular focus of a man who was trying not to look like he was listening. "They know you've been moved off 40, Mason said, watching Vivian. "They're sweeping the floors to find you." A beat. They also specifically asked for Marcus Webb. The room, the small, dim, concrete-scented corridor that was the room, went quiet. Vivian turned to look at Marcus. Not quickly. She turned the way you turn when you've already made a decision and you're just confirming the last piece of information you needed. Marcus Webb said, "That doesn't mean anything." "I didn't say it meant anything," Vivian said. "You're looking at me like, I'm looking at you, she said, because someone said your name on a radio frequency in a building where my security team has been neutralized and my emergency lighting was sabotaged before the biggest announcement in my company's history. That's why I'm looking at you, Marcus. Her voice was level, not angry, something colder than angry. So you can talk now or you can talk later, but I would strongly suggest you choose now, because later is going to have very different conditions. Marcus Webb was 53 years old, had made his first million before 40, and had a jawline that his colleagues described as reassuring. Right now, the jawline was doing nothing for him. He looked like a man who had rehearsed a version of this moment in his head and found that the actual version was considerably worse. I didn't know it would go this far, he said. In the silence that followed, Mason heard Daniel breathe, heard Presley go very still, heard the faint crackle of the radio at his belt. Say that again, Vivian said quietly. It wasn't supposed to be. There were just supposed to be documents. Access to the Meridian files before the announcement, proof that the Pacific valuation was Marcus. They told me it was just corporate due diligence, a competing interest, Marcus. Her voice cut him off like a door closing. Who is they? He looked at the floor. For a long moment he said nothing, and Mason watched him decide. Watched the precise moment when the calculation shifted from self-preservation through silence to self-preservation through disclosure. Because they were different exits, and Marcus Webb was a lawyer, and lawyers, in Mason's experience, always eventually chose the exit that kept them talking. Gregor Sue, Marcus said. Vivian's expression didn't change. That stillness, that total, controlled stillness, was something Mason had seen before, and people who received information that rearranged something fundamental about their world and refused to let the rearrangement show on their face. It was a discipline. It cost something. Gregor Sue, she repeated. He approached me 4 months ago. He said there were irregularities in the Pacific acquisition that would expose you to... There are no irregularities in the Pacific acquisition. I know that now. You knew it then. You reviewed every document in that acquisition. You signed the final legal clearance. Her voice was still level, still cold. So what he actually offered you was something other than legal protection. Marcus said nothing. How much? She asked. He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Gregor Sue, Mason said, because the name was new to him and he needed context. Who is he? Board member, Vivian said, without looking away from Marcus. 15% share in Holloway Corporation. 3 years on the board. He's been positioning to take control of the company for 18 months. A pause. He was at the event tonight. He was one of the first people I spoke to when guests arrived. Mason thought about the man he'd watched near the catering station, and then he thought again, because that man was somewhere closer to 30 and had moved like someone in the field, not someone in a boardroom. Soot was somewhere else, which meant Soot was watching this from a distance, with clean hands, while the people he'd hired took the risk. He's not in the building, Mason said. No, Vivian agreed. He never would be. She finally looked away from Marcus and looked at Mason instead. The evidence. The real evidence of what he did tonight, the communication between him and Marcus, the financial arrangement, the operational planning. Where would it be? Mason thought. His end or yours? Mine. He would have been careful about what he kept on his own systems. But the access Marcus gave him would have created a trail in our company servers. Her jaw tightened slightly. The server room on 37, which they were trying to reach, which they need to reach to delete it. She straightened. We need to get there first. Mason looked at the radio in his hand. He thought about the voice on it, the command voice, the one that had said Webb specifically and find her. He thought about the 2 men zip-tied on the 37th floor corridor and how long before someone checked on them. He thought about Emma, which he knew was irrational timing, but which happened anyway, the way it always did. The small, specific image of her at the piano with her jaw tight, rushing her left hand in the 3rd section, trying to go faster than she was ready to go. Slow down, he heard himself thinking. See everything. Move when you know where you're going. He looked at the group. Daniel Cho, frightened and steady. A good combination. Presley, barefoot and sharp. Marcus Webb, who had made a catastrophic decision and was now sitting with it in a concrete stairwell. and Vivian Holloway, who was looking at Mason with the expression of someone who had revised their understanding of a situation and was waiting to see if the new version held. "I need to tell you something," Mason said to her. "All right. I know how to do this. Get to 37, get to the evidence, get you out of this building." He said it simply because complication would waste time, and she seemed like a woman who valued direct information over framed information. "But you're going to have questions about how I know how to do this, and I can't answer those questions right now. I need you to accept that and keep moving." Vivian looked at him for a moment. There was something in that look that wasn't quite trust. It was too early for trust, and she seemed like a woman who knew the difference between trust and calculated pragmatism. This was the latter. "I already had questions," she said, "when I watched you handle an evacuation of 40-odd people in the dark in under 3 minutes without a flashlight or a radio. I decided I'd keep them for later." "Later works," he said. "What do you need from us?" He looked at Marcus Webb. "I need him to know the server room access code." Marcus looked up. "Do you know it?" Mason asked. A pause. Then, "Yes." "Then you're coming with us," Mason said. It wasn't particularly gentle, but it wasn't cruel either. Marcus Webb had made his bed. The least useful thing Mason could do right now was pile on about it. "And you're going to be useful on the way there, because right now useful is the only currency that matters." He handed Daniel Cho the radio. "You're going to monitor this and tell me if the frequency changes or if you hear anything about 37. Daniel took it with both hands. "What do I listen for?" "Anything that sounds like they know where we are." "How will I know if—" "You'll know," Mason said. "Trust your gut. It's usually right when you're scared." Daniel nodded, not fully believing that, but accepting it. Mason looked at Presley. "You good?" She blinked. Apparently nobody had asked her that in the last 40 minutes. "I'm better without the heels," she said. "Smart call." He opened the stairwell door and looked up. Clear. "We go up, single file. No talking on the stairs unless I stop, and if I stop, everyone stops." He looked at all of them. "Questions?" Nobody had questions. They went up. On the 37th floor landing, Mason held the door and listened. The corridor was quiet. Not naturally quiet, but the specific quiet of a space where 2 people had recently been removed from it. He pushed the door open and scanned both directions. His men were still on the floor where he'd left them, and they were still secured, and the server room door was still locked. Marcus Webb typed in the code with the particular care of a man who understood that this moment was the one he'd be explaining for the rest of his life. The door opened. Inside, the servers hummed in their racks, small indicator lights blinking in the dark like patient creatures that had no idea what was happening around them. Vivian was through the door before anyone else, moving to the primary terminal, and Mason stood in the doorway and watched the corridor and listened to the building around him. Somewhere on a floor above, he could hear movement, slow and methodical, and getting less distant. "How long do you need?" he asked. Vivian's hands were on the keyboard. "Give me 10 minutes. He thought about the movement above. He thought about the radio and the command voice and the professional patience of people who were being paid to complete an objective and hadn't completed it yet. "You've got 7, he said. From the terminal, without looking up. "Then I'll use 7. Mason Reid turned back to the corridor and stood in the doorway with the door at his back and the dark hallway in front of him, and he breathed slowly, and he watched, and he waited. Because waiting when it mattered was something he was very good at, even when it cost him. And tonight it was going to cost him something. He could feel that already, the way you feel weather coming before you can see it in the sky. He just didn't know yet exactly what the price was going to be. The 7 minutes felt like 20 and like 2 at the same time. Mason stood in the doorway of the server room with his shoulder blades 6 inches from the doorframe and his eyes moving in a slow, steady pattern down the corridor. Near left, far left, near right, far right, back to center. The way a person's eyes move when they've trained that movement into muscle memory, so deep it doesn't require conscious instruction anymore. His breathing was even. His hands were loose at his sides. From the outside, someone might have mistaken him for a man who was simply waiting for an elevator. Inside, he was doing calculations that had nothing to do with math. He could hear Vivian at the terminal behind him. The keystrokes were fast and deliberate, not frantic, the rhythm of someone who knew what they were looking for and was navigating toward it rather than searching blindly. Daniel stood against the wall near the server racks with the radio pressed close to his ear. Presley sat on the floor beside him, back against the rack, legs folded, watching the door with the particular alertness of someone who had decided that fear was not going to be useful tonight and had mostly succeeded at setting it aside. Marcus Webb stood near the terminal, not helping and not leaving, which was about what Mason had expected from him at this point. The radio crackled. Daniel looked up. Mason crossed the room in 4 steps. Daniel handed it over without being asked. The voice was the command voice, the one from 37, the one that had said, "Find her and Webb specifically," with the measured patience of someone who treated operational setbacks as scheduling problems rather than crises. That steadiness, Mason knew, was not confidence. It was professionalism. And professional people who were being paid to complete an objective and hadn't completed it yet didn't give up. They adjusted. Confirm package is not on 40. Repeat, package is not on 40. Kessler, pull your team from 39 and move to 36 through 38. Grid sweep. Start from the service corridors. A pause, then. And someone find out why Nolan and Price aren't answering. Nolan and Price were almost certainly his men on the floor outside. The zip ties in the corridor floor had answered that question, but the voice on the radio didn't know that yet. He had maybe 4 minutes before the grid sweep reached 37. He walked back to the doorway and looked down the corridor in both directions again. Still empty, but empty in the way a room is empty right before it isn't. "Vivian," he said. "I know," she said, without turning around. 4 minutes. "I heard the radio." He waited 1 more second, then went back to watching the corridor because that was the only thing he could do for her right now, and so it was the thing he was going to do completely. Behind him, the keystrokes continued. The servers hummed. The indicator lights blinked their patient, indifferent pattern. 2 minutes passed. Then Vivian said, "I've got it." He turned. She was looking at the screen with an expression that wasn't triumph. It was something harder and colder than triumph, the expression of someone who has confirmed something they already suspected and finds the confirmation not satisfying but clarifying. The communication logs between Marcus's internal account and an external encrypted address. 4 months of correspondence. She didn't look at Marcus. Access records showing someone used his credentials to pull the Meridian files 3 weeks ago, and a wire transfer notation in the building security vendor contract, the company that installed our emergency lighting system, that traces back to a holding company that Gregor Sue controls. "Can you get that out of this room?" Mason asked. "I've already sent an encrypted copy to my personal external server, and I've flagged the access records with our IT forensic protocol, which means they'll be automatically preserved and can't be deleted remotely." She stood up from the terminal. "They came here to erase this. They can't erase it anymore." Mason looked at her for a moment. He noticed that her hands, when she stepped away from the keyboard, were not entirely steady. She was controlling it, pressing her fingertips briefly against her thigh in a gesture so small most people wouldn't catch it, but her hands were not steady. He said nothing about it because it wasn't the kind of thing you say something about. "We need to go," he said. "Where?" Daniel asked. That was the right question, and Mason had been working on the answer since they'd come up the stairs. The building had 4 main exits, all of which were almost certainly being monitored. The freight loading dock on the 2nd floor ran to an exterior alley that connected to the street 2 buildings over, and it used a separate keycard system from the main building security network, which meant it might not have been compromised in the initial takeover of the security systems. Might not. That was the margin he was working with. "Loading dock on 2, he said. "We go down the service stairwell, not the main one. Stays internal to the maintenance corridor system. They probably know it exists, but they don't know this building the way I do." "You know this building very well," Presley said, from the floor where she was getting to her feet. It wasn't an accusation exactly, more like a door left open. 8 months, Mason said. He wasn't going to walk through the door right now, and everyone in the room understood that. Almost everyone. Marcus Webb looked at him with the expression of a man who wanted to ask follow-up questions but had used up his goodwill for the evening. "Let's move," Vivian said, and that ended that. They went back to the corridor, and Mason pulled the server room door shut behind them. He looked at the 2 men still zip-tied on the floor, who were conscious and watching with the particular focused attention of trained people who were committed to doing their jobs even from the floor. The one who'd had the flashlight met Mason's eyes, and something passed between them, a kind of professional acknowledgement, not friendly, not hostile, just two people who recognized something in each other from a distance that most people didn't know existed. "Building security and police are going to find you within the next 30 minutes, Mason told him. "I'd encourage you to be cooperative when they do." The man said nothing. His expression said that cooperation was not currently his top priority. Mason left them there and moved his group toward the service stairwell. He took the stairs carefully, one landing at a time, stopping at each floor to listen before pushing through. 35, 33, 30. He could feel the tension in the group behind him like a physical thing. Daniel managing it with quiet breathing, Presley with silence, Marcus with the barely audible sound of a man who is trying not to let his shoes squeak on metal stairs and failing mildly. Vivian moved without sound. He'd noticed that about her earlier and noticed it again now. She'd had some training, or she'd spent enough time around people with training that she'd absorbed the principles of it. You didn't move through dangerous space like that from instinct alone. At the 22nd floor landing, the radio barked. Mason stopped. Everybody stopped. "Stairwell team, this is command. We have confirmation of target on service stairs somewhere between floors 20 and 35. Tighten the net. I want 2 people on the loading dock, 2 on the main lobby freight entrance. Nobody leaves." He'd been right about the loading dock, which was the bad news. The good news was they'd said floors 20 to 35, which meant they didn't know exactly where in the stairwell the group was, which meant there was still a margin and he needed to use it before the margin closed. He pressed the radio to his chest to muffle the speaker and turned to the group. "Change of plan," he said, quiet and flat. "Loading dock is covered. We're going to floor 8. "Why 8? Daniel whispered. "Because the HVAC maintenance access on 8 connects to a utility shaft that runs to the parking structure on the north side of the building. The parking structure has a street-level pedestrian exit that opens to Keller Street, not the main boulevard, and it's not part of this building's security footprint." He paused. "It's a tight corridor. You'll have to go single file and stay low." Nobody asked how he knew about a utility shaft connection between the 8th floor and the parking structure. If they asked later, he'd answer. For now, the only useful thing about the information was whether it worked, and they were about to find out. "Tight like how tight?" Presley said. "Like you'll be glad you took the heels off." She nodded. That was enough. Marcus said, "I want it on record that I'm cooperating fully." "The record," Vivian said, in a tone that managed to convey both acknowledgement and complete contempt in 4 syllables, "will reflect whatever actually happens. Start walking." They went down. At the 8th floor, Mason opened the stairwell door and swept the corridor with the same careful patience he'd used on every floor. Empty. He moved them out into the corridor and toward the north side of the building, past a break room with its lights on and someone's cold cup of coffee sitting forgotten on a table. Details of the ordinary world sitting alongside everything that was happening, unbothered by the gap between them. The HVAC maintenance access was a panel in the north wall, 4 feet wide and 3 feet high, secured with a hex bolt that he opened with a tool from his shirt pocket. He'd been through this access point twice in the past 3 months for routine ductwork inspection. The shaft beyond it ran horizontal for about 40 feet before opening into the larger mechanical space above the parking structure's 2nd level. He pulled the panel open. The space beyond was dark and smelled like machine oil and recycled air. He looked at the group. "I go first, then Presley, then Daniel, then—" He glanced at Vivian. "You." "I'll go last," she said. "I know you want to. I'm telling you you won't." He looked at Marcus. "Webb goes last." Marcus stared at the opening. "You're serious?" "There's a flashlight function on your phone. Use it. Keep moving forward and don't stop, because if you stop, you block everyone behind you." "What if—" "You won't get stuck," Mason said, because that was what Marcus was actually afraid of. "The passage is 40 feet. It opens into a larger space. Keep moving." He went in first, pulling himself on his elbows through the dark and the smell of metal and old grease, moving with the compact efficiency of someone who'd been in spaces considerably worse than this. The metal was cool against his forearms. Behind him, he could hear Presley enter. She was quick about it, no hesitation. Then Daniel, slightly slower. Then Vivian, smooth and controlled. Then Marcus, who made a sound. "Keep moving," Mason said from the front. I'm forward, mister. Webb, don't stop." "There's something on my, ductwork," Mason said. "It's ductwork. Keep moving." At the end of 40 feet, the shaft opened into the mechanical space, a high-ceiling chamber full of electrical conduit and support beams, dimly lit from the parking structure below through a grated floor section. Mason dropped down first, then helped Presley, then Daniel. Vivian dropped without help, landing cleanly, and he noted it. Marcus came last, awkward and breathing hard, and he landed with significantly less grace than everyone else, but he landed, which was the part that mattered. The parking structure was quiet at this level. Most of the guest vehicles were valet staged elsewhere for the event. 2 cars sat in isolated spots, their windows dark. A fluorescent tube light on the far wall buzzed and flickered with the kind of rhythm that suggested it had been doing that for months, and nobody had gotten around to fixing it. Mason's kind of job, under different circumstances. He moved them through the structure toward the north pedestrian exit, checking corners as he went. The exit was a steel door with a push bar that opened to Keller Street. He pressed his ear to it and listened for 10 seconds before deciding it was clear. "When this door opens," he said, "we move right, not left. Stay tight to the building exterior. There's a bus shelter 40 yards up the block. We go there, we call for help, and we do not stop moving until we're at the shelter." "My phone has no signal since the 2nd floor," Daniel said. "Mine either," Presley said. Mason thought about that. Someone had set up a signal jammer, probably within the building's security infrastructure, which meant outside the building's footprint, their phones should work again. "Once we're through the door and away from the building, your signal should come back," he said. "First call goes to Chicago PD, not building security, direct to police." He looked at Vivian. "Do you have a direct contact at CPD?" "Deputy Superintendent Karen Ossie. I have her personal number." "Use it. Don't call through your company line. If someone had access to your internal systems through Marcus, your communications infrastructure may be compromised." She looked at him with an expression that had moved somewhere past calculated pragmatism. He wasn't sure what it was exactly. He wasn't going to take time figuring it out right now. "Ready?" he asked. They were. He pushed the door open. The November air hit them like cold water immediately and without ceremony. The street was quiet. This side of the block was industrial, service alley adjacent, the kind of Chicago block that looked deserted at night and wasn't really deserted but was close enough. Across the street, a food delivery driver on a bicycle moved through a pool of streetlight without looking up. Mason moved them right, tight to the wall, and they moved quickly without running. Running draws attention in a way that fast walking usually doesn't. 40 yards to the bus shelter, which was empty at this hour, its plastic walls scratched and stickered, its overhead light working, a faded advertisement for a personal injury law firm occupying the back panel with an image of a man in a suit who looked too clean to be believed. Vivian had her phone out before she reached the shelter. She stood with it, waiting, and Mason watched her face in the moment her signal came back. The small exhale, barely visible, the thumb moving to contacts and scrolling with the efficient speed of someone who didn't waste movements. She put the phone to her ear. 2 rings. "Karen." Her voice was steady, completely steady, in a way that Mason thought probably cost her something. "It's Vivian Holloway. I need you to listen to me carefully, and I need you to send people to the Holloway Corporation building on Michigan Avenue right now. I'll explain everything when you get here, but I need you to trust me for the next 60 seconds. A brief pause. "Yes, I know what time it is. I know." Another pause. "Thank you." She lowered the phone and looked at Mason. "They're sending units. She wants us to stay put." "We stay put," Mason said. In the shelter, Presley sat on the bench and put her head back against the plastic wall and closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Just 3. Like she was allowing herself exactly that much before she came back. Daniel stood with his arms crossed against the cold, looking up the block toward the building they'd left. Marcus sat on the far end of the bench, away from everyone, with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the ground. Vivian remained standing. She looked at the building, the tall glass face of it, lit normally on its lower floors and dark at the top, the 40th floor still without power. She looked at it the way you look at something that has just shown you something about itself you weren't prepared to see, and you're trying to decide what to do with that new information. 4 months, she said. Not to anyone specifically. To the air, maybe. To herself. He was in my boardroom 4 months ago. We had dinner. He gave a speech at the company's 20th anniversary event in September. She stopped. He gave a toast. Mason didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say, and he wasn't in the habit of filling silences with words that were just noise. I vetted him, she said, when he joined the board. I vetted everyone. I had 2 independent firms run background analyses. I have protocols. She said the word protocols the way you say a word when it has just failed you completely, and you're not sure if you're angry at the word or yourself. People don't show up as what they are in background analyses, Mason said. She turned to look at him. Is that experience talking? He considered the question for a moment. Yeah, he said. It is. She held his gaze for a second. Then, you knew about the junction box at 5:30. You had zip ties in your toolbox. You cleared 37 in under 2 minutes in the dark without a weapon. She let that sit. I'm a thorough person, Mason. I notice things. He said nothing. I'm not going to ask you tonight, she said, but I'm going to ask you. I know, he said. She looked back at the building. Then she said something he hadn't expected. Your daughter, you mentioned her on the phone, Emma, right? He was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. Yeah. How old? 11, she nodded slowly. Is she with someone tonight? A neighbor, Mrs. Garza. She's reliable. Vivian turned back toward the building and was quiet for a while. Then, my parents worked double shifts until I was 13. I used to walk home from school and let myself in with a key I kept on a string around my neck, and I'd make dinner and watch TV until midnight waiting for them. A beat. I told myself for a long time that I understood what that was like, being the person others were waiting for. She paused. I don't think I fully did. Mason didn't know exactly what to do with that. It was an honest thing, said in an honest way, from a woman who he suspected didn't often say honest things to people she'd known for less than 3 hours. He decided to accept it as what it was. She's used to it, he said. Emma, the waiting. Does that make it better? No, he said. Vivian nodded, like that was the right answer. Beside them, Marcus Webb made a small sound. Not words, just a sound. The kind that comes out of a person when the weight of what they've done settles fully into them and there's no more room to push it aside. Mason looked at him briefly. Marcus had his face in his hands now, elbows on his knees. He told me it would protect the company, Marcus said from behind his hands. He said the Pacific deal had hidden exposure and that you were moving too fast, and that if it collapsed, it would take the whole company with it. He said, he told me I'd be saving it. Nobody responded. I should have, Marcus started. Yes, Vivian said simply. Not unkindly, exactly, but without any softness either. You should have. Silence returned. Somewhere up the block, a car passed slowly, headlights sweeping across the bus shelter entrance. Then Daniel Cho, who had been quietly watching the street, said, There's someone at the building's main entrance. Mason was already looking. He saw what Daniel saw. A figure on the main boulevard side, standing at the building's front entrance with his hands in his coat pockets, looking up at the darkened 40th floor with the studied casualness of a man who was pretending to be a bystander. He was 130 yards away, across a block and around a corner, partially visible through the gap between buildings. But Mason could see him clearly enough. He was in his mid-60s. Silver-haired, well-dressed even at this distance, with the posture of a man who'd spent decades in rooms where posture was a form of currency. He had his phone to his ear now, and whatever he was hearing was not good news, because his free hand came out of his pocket and pressed flat against the building's exterior wall in the small, controlled gesture of a man absorbing information he didn't like. Is that? Daniel started. Gregor Soot, Vivian said. Her voice had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that broke the surface, but Mason heard it. The particular tightening that happens when something abstract becomes concrete, When a name attached to a plan becomes a face standing on a sidewalk under a streetlight making a phone call because his plan had failed. She started to move. Mason's hand came out and caught her arm. Not forceful, just present. "Police are 3 minutes away," he said. "He'll be gone in 3 minutes. He'll have a car waiting. Vivian." She stopped. Looked at his hand on her arm. He let go. "If you go to him now, there's no chain of evidence. There's no documented crime. There's a confrontation on a sidewalk and his lawyers will build a wall around it before morning." He kept his voice even. "The evidence you pulled from the server room is safe. The communication logs, the wire transfer, Marcus's testimony. That's what holds him. Not a conversation on Michigan Avenue." She looked up the block at Sue's figure for a long moment. "He's standing outside my building," she said. "Watching it burn. I know. He thinks he won. Yeah. And I have to stand here and let him think that for 3 more minutes. 2.5, Mason said. Another silence. Longer this time. Then she looked back at Sue one more time, and something moved across her face that Mason couldn't fully name. Not acceptance exactly, more like the decision to delay a thing that wasn't going away, which is a different and harder kind of patience than simply letting something go. 2.5 minutes, she said. 2.5, he confirmed. They stood in the bus shelter in the cold November air, and the fluorescent light overhead buzzed steadily. And Marcus Webb sat with his face in his hands, and Daniel and Presley stood close together, the way people stand when the particular night they've just survived has made them suddenly aware of the value of proximity. And Mason Reid stood at the shelter entrance and watched the street with the same slow, steady attention he'd maintained all night, and tried not to think about whether he'd remembered to tell Mrs. Garza where the spare phone charger was, because Emma's phone died at inconvenient times, and she would need it when she woke up and found he still wasn't home. The first police siren reached them at what felt like exactly 2.5 minutes, rising from several blocks south and growing quickly. Blue lights appeared at the far end of the block, then more behind them, and Mason watched Sue's figure on the boulevard side stiffen and hold perfectly still for 3 seconds. The stillness of someone doing fast math about what the arrival of multiple police vehicles meant for the situation he was currently standing in the middle of. Then Sue started to move. He was smooth about it, unhurried, turning from the building wall like a man who'd simply finished looking at something interesting and had decided to move on. Professional distance from whatever was happening, nothing to do with him, just a bystander. He made it 6 steps before 3 officers came around the corner from the south and 2 more from the north, and Deputy Superintendent Karen Osei, tall, direct, moving with the unhurried speed of someone who knew exactly where she was going, came through the middle of the block with a phone in her hand and her eyes already sweeping the area. Her eyes landed on Vivian. She walked toward this bus shelter, and as she did, one of the officers near the building entrance said something to Sue, and Sue stopped, and for the first time all evening his composure showed a crack. Just a small one, a half second of something genuine breaking through the surface, before it sealed over again. But it had been there. Mason had seen it. Ms. Holloway. Karen Osei reached the shelter and took in the group with a comprehensive look that covered all 5 of them in about 4 seconds. "Are you hurt?" "No," Vivian said. "None of us are." She looked at Marcus Webb. "We have a cooperative witness and approximately 4 months of documented evidence that I can walk your forensic team through as soon as you're ready." Osei looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the ground. "All right," Osei said. She looked at Mason. "And you are?" "Mason Reid, maintenance contractor. I've been working in this building for 8 months. She looked at him for a moment with the practiced, calibrated attention of someone who had learned to hear what wasn't being said. Then she said, "Okay, Mr. Reid," in the tone of someone who was storing a question for later, which was becoming a consistent response to him tonight, and which he accepted as fair. "There are 2 individuals secured on the 37th floor corridor," he said, "and I can give your team a full rundown of the building entry points that were compromised tonight." He paused. "There's also a tampered junction box on the 40th floor near the north wall. That's where it started. That's where whoever planned this put their hands on the building first. Your forensic team should start there." Osei pulled out a notepad. Old school, paper and pen, the kind of choice that Mason had always respected in certain professionals. "Can you walk me through the timeline?" "Yes," he said. And he did. He talked for 11 minutes, standing at the entrance of a bus shelter on Keller Street while police units moved around the building, and Gregor Sue stood 40 yards away with an officer beside him and a phone that, for the first time in a very long evening, he apparently had no one useful to call. Mason talked through the junction box and the security patterns and the stairwells and the two men on 37 and the shaft to the parking structure and the radio frequency. He was precise and complete, and kept his voice level throughout, because level voices in crisis debrief produce usable information, and usable information was the only thing that mattered at this stage. When he finished, Osei closed the notepad and said, "Mr. Reid, in my experience, maintenance contractors don't typically conduct building evacuations, neutralize armed operatives, and secure server room evidence in sequence." "No," Mason agreed. "I imagine we'll have a longer conversation." "I imagine so." She held his gaze for a moment, then made a small sound, not quite a laugh, more like an acknowledgement, and turned back toward the building, already directing two of her officers toward the entry points Mason had described. He stepped back from the cluster of activity, away from the lights and the radios and the movement, to the edge of the shelter where it was quieter. He pulled out his phone and looked at the time. 11:47 p.m. He had 3 missed messages from Emma. The first, "Dad, it's almost 11. The second, "Okay, it's 11:30 and Mrs. Garza is asleep. I don't want to wake her." The third, at 11:43, "Are you okay?" He sat down on the bus shelter bench, the first time he'd sat down in several hours, and typed back, "Mason, I'm okay. On my way home soon. Sorry it's late." The response came in under a minute. "Emma, okay, I stayed up." Mason, "I know you did." Emma, "You owe me." He almost smiled. Almost. Mason, "I know that too." A pause. Then, "Emma, was it bad tonight?" He looked at the building. His building, the one he'd spent 8 months learning from the inside out, the one that had just shown him that some things you bury don't stay buried, they just wait for the night when they're needed most. Mason, "It was fine," he typed. "Go to sleep. I'll be there." He put the phone in his pocket and sat with his hands on his knees for a moment, just breathing the cold air, just letting the night settle around him the way nights eventually do when the worst of them is over. Across the sidewalk, Vivian Holloway was talking to Karen Osei with the composed precision of someone giving testimony. Organized, sequential, complete. The controlled hand gesture toward the building, the careful word choice, the way she'd rebuilt her composure between the bus shelter and the sidewalk, not performing it but actually inhabiting it, because whatever she was feeling she'd put somewhere else for now and picked up the things she needed instead. He watched her for a moment. Then he looked away, because it wasn't his moment to watch. It was hers. He was just the man who'd made sure she got to have it. He got home at 12:53 in the morning. Mrs. Garza had left the kitchen light on, which she always did when she knew he'd be late, and the sight of that single warm rectangle in the window of his apartment building did something to his chest that he didn't have a name for and didn't try to find one. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment before going in, breathing the cold air, letting the night finish transitioning from what it had been to what it was going to be from now on. His left shoulder ached. He hadn't registered it during the building. Adrenaline was a reliable editor of physical information. But now that the adrenaline had finished its work and clocked out, the shoulder was making itself known. He'd taken a bad angle on the second man in the 37th floor corridor, the one who'd reached for his belt, and the correction had involved a torque through the shoulder that his 36-year-old body was evidently going to invoice him for. He rolled it once, felt the specific complaint of it, and went inside. Emma was asleep on the couch. She'd tried not to be. He could tell because the television was on at low volume, tuned to some nature documentary with the sound mostly down, and her legs were still in the position of someone who'd been sitting upright and had simply lost the argument with sleep somewhere around midnight. She had a blanket pulled up to her chin that she'd definitely gotten herself, because Mrs. Garza would have put her in her room. The independence in that small detail, getting her own blanket, making herself comfortable in the living room to wait, was so completely Emma that it settled something in him he hadn't fully known was unsettled. He stood in the doorway between the hall and the living room for a moment, not moving. On the television, something enormous and quiet moved through deep ocean water in slow motion. The narrator's voice was too low to make out words, just tone, steady and contemplative, the voice of someone describing a world that operated by completely different rules than the one Mason had just spent his evening in. He crossed to the couch and crouched beside it. "M," he said quietly. She made the sound she always made when she was being woken up from deep sleep, a specific syllable that wasn't quite a word, somewhere between protest and acknowledgement. Her eyes opened partially. "Hey," he said. "You're home," she said, still mostly asleep, confirming a fact. "I'm home. What time is it?" "Late. Go to your room." She looked at him for a moment with the half-focused gaze of someone who was not yet fully in the waking world, and he saw the moment, the specific small moment, when she registered something in his face that made her come the rest of the way awake. "What happened to your jacket?" she asked. He looked down. He hadn't noticed until now. His right sleeve had a tear near the elbow, and there was a dark smear of grease or grime across the front panel that hadn't been there when he left this morning. He also probably had concrete dust in his hair from the utility shaft, and the general appearance of a man who had spent his evening somewhere considerably more demanding than a routine maintenance shift. "Had a complicated night," he said. She sat up slightly, the blanket still around her shoulders. The sleep was fully gone from her eyes now. She looked at him with the same expression she used when she thought he wasn't being straight with her. Not angry, just attentive in a specific and uncomfortable way that reminded him of nobody so much as himself. "You're okay?" she asked. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "I look tired. That's different from fine." "Dad." "I'm okay, Emma. I promise." He meant it. He also knew that meant was not the same thing as easy, and that she was 11 and had figured out that distinction approximately 2 years ago. "I'll explain what I can in the morning. Go to bed." She looked at him for another moment. Then she got up from the couch, still wrapped in the blanket, and walked the 3 steps to where he was crouching and put her arms around his neck in the specific and uncomplicated way that children hug people when they've decided to stop asking questions for now. He put his arms around her and held on and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. After a moment, she pulled back and looked at him. "You owe me breakfast," she said. "I know. The good kind, not cereal. Eggs and toast. And the potatoes. And the potatoes." She studied him one more time, then she turned and went down the hall to her room, the blanket trailing behind her, and he heard her door close with the soft click that meant she was actually going to sleep and not just going to her room to stay awake and worry, which was a distinction that mattered to him. He sat on the floor next to the couch for a while. The documentary continued on the television, the deep ocean world moving in slow silence. Something about the light down there, the way it filtered through impossible depths, reaching things that almost never got reached, made him feel more tired than he already was. He turned the TV off and sat in the dark of his own apartment and let the quiet settle around him. His phone had 17 notifications. He'd muted it when he left the scene on Keller Street, and he hadn't unmuted it. He looked at the screen now without opening anything. 3 were from an unknown number that had texted after midnight, which was almost certainly someone from Deputy Superintendent Osei's office following up on the statement he'd given. 2 were from his maintenance supervisor, Garcia, who had apparently seen something about the Holloway Corporation building on the news and was asking if Mason was involved. The rest were from news alerts that his phone had pulled automatically, because by 11 p.m., the story was already moving. He put the phone face down on the coffee table. He thought about the moment in the bus shelter when Karen Osei had looked at him and said, "In my experience, maintenance contractors don't typically conduct building evacuations, neutralize armed operatives, and secure server room evidence in sequence." He thought about the longer conversation she'd said they'd have. He thought about the fact that that conversation, whenever it happened, was going to involve questions that had answers he'd spent 3 years not giving to anyone, and that the option of continuing not to give them had probably expired sometime around 7:53 p.m. when the lights went out on the 40th floor. He was not afraid of the conversation. He was tired of carrying the weight of not having it. There was a difference, and he was only now, in his dark living room at 1 a.m, beginning to understand what that difference meant. He made the eggs and the potatoes in the morning. Emma ate with the focused efficiency of someone who'd been promised a specific thing and intended to fully receive it, and she asked him 4 questions, and he answered 3 of them honestly and deflected the 4th. Which one was which, she probably knew. And by the time she left for school at 7:45, the apartment smelled like butter and coffee and the particular warmth of a morning that was trying to be ordinary. It didn't fully succeed, but it tried. He was doing dishes when his phone rang, the unknown number from last night now calling. He dried his hands and answered. "Mr. Reid," a woman's voice, professional and direct. "This is Claire Tan from Deputy Superintendent Osei's office. We'd like to schedule a formal interview at your earliest convenience. Given the nature of last night's events, we're treating this as urgent. I'd ideally like to arrange something for today." "This afternoon works," he said. "After 2. 2:30? 2:30 is fine." A brief pause. "I also want to make you aware that we've had a separate inquiry from a federal agency regarding your involvement. That's not something you need to address today, but I wanted to give you notice so you're not caught off guard." He leaned against the counter. "Which agency?" "I'm not in a position to say over the phone, but Mr. Reid," another pause, slightly different in quality, slightly more human. It wasn't a complaint. He thanked her and ended the call and stood in his kitchen for a while longer than the dishes required. Federal agency. Not a complaint. He knew what that meant. He'd known people who'd gotten those calls in the years before Chicago, after they'd done things that overlapped with federal interests in ways that couldn't be officially acknowledged, but also couldn't be entirely ignored. The calls always came wrapped in careful language and plausible distances. They were a form of attention that felt like neutrality and wasn't. He wasn't surprised. He was tired. He put the dishes away and went to get his jacket, the one without the tear, and he drove to the interview. The police interview lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was conducted by 2 detectives and observed by Karen Osei herself, who sat at the back of the room and said almost nothing and took notes that Mason suspected were less about the facts of the evening, which the 2 detectives covered comprehensively, and more about him specifically. The way he answered, what he mentioned without being asked, what he didn't mention until he was asked directly, how he held himself in the chair. He told the truth. All of it, in sequence, the way he described it to Osei on the street the night before, but with more detail and more precision. The junction box at 5:30, the tracking pattern of the man near the catering station, the timing of the stairwell doors, the 2 men on 37, the radio, the utility shaft. He described what he'd done and how and in what order, and when one of the detectives asked how he'd been able to neutralize 2 trained operatives without a weapon and without injury to himself, Mason said, "Training," and left the door open exactly that wide, because he knew from experience that sometimes a small offered word is a more effective fence than a flat refusal. The detective looked at him. "What kind of training?" "Military," he said. "I was in the Army." "What branch?" "Special Forces," he said, and felt the particular sensation of a word that had lived in his chest for 3 years, finally being said out loud to someone who would write it in an official document. It felt less dramatic than he'd expected. It felt, honestly, like putting something down that had gotten heavy. The detective wrote it. Osei's pen moved at the back of the room. "Were you acting in any official capacity last night?" the second detective asked. "No," he said. "I was there as a maintenance contractor. I made choices as a private individual." "Were those choices," the detective searched for phrasing, "consistent with your prior training?" "Yes," Mason said simply. The interview continued. By the end of it, he had given a complete and accurate account of everything that had happened inside the Holloway Corporation building, and the only thing he had not addressed was the 11 years before Chicago, because nobody had asked him to go there yet, and he had learned long ago that volunteering information that hadn't been requested was a habit that cost more than it earned. When it was done, Osei walked him to the door herself. In the hallway, out of earshot of the interview room, she said, "The 2 men from 37 are being cooperative. They were contracted through a private security firm that traces back to 3 other firms, the outermost of which has paper connections to a Cayman Island holding company." She paused. "We're going to get to Sue. It'll take time, but we're going to get there." I know, he said. The federal inquiry, she said. I know about it. I want you to know I have no problem with it. She looked at him steadily. Whatever you did before Chicago, Mr. Reid, it wasn't a problem last night. He held her gaze. Thank you, Deputy Superintendent. Karen, she said, given what you did in that building, I think we've cleared the formality bar. He almost smiled. Almost. 3 days after the night of the Meridian announcement, Vivian Holloway called him. He was in a parking garage on the north side of the city, diagnosing an electrical fault in a commercial HVAC unit for a client who had nothing to do with any of this, which was exactly the kind of work he needed to be doing on a Thursday morning. Ordinary, specific, requiring his attention in a way that left no room for anything else. His phone showed her name, which meant she'd gotten his number from building management or from the police report or from some other route that a woman with her resources would have no difficulty finding. He looked at it for a moment before answering. Ms. Holloway? Vivian, she said. After a night like that, I think we've cleared the formality bar. He recognized the echo of Osei's words and wondered briefly if that was intentional. With Vivian, he suspected most things were intentional. Vivian, he said, are you free Saturday morning? He thought about it. Emma had practice until noon. Afternoon. 1 o'clock. I'd like to meet in person. A brief pause. I owe you a conversation. You don't owe me anything. That's not actually your call, she said, and he heard something in it that wasn't unkind but wasn't open to negotiation either. 1 o'clock Saturday. I'll send you an address. He agreed, and she ended the call, and he went back to the HVAC unit. The address she sent was not her office building. It was a restaurant in Lincoln Park. Not flashy, not expensive in the way of places trying to be impressive, just a good quiet place with wooden tables and a lunch menu and the particular atmosphere of somewhere that people went to actually talk rather than to be seen talking. He appreciated the choice, though he wasn't surprised by it. She was already there when he arrived, at a corner table with her back to the wall. Another unconscious or deliberate choice that he noted and said nothing about. She had coffee and was looking at her phone when he walked in, and she put the phone face down on the table before he reached her, which was the kind of attention that said something about how she'd decided to approach this conversation. She looked better than she had in the bus shelter. Not more composed. She'd been composed in the bus shelter, at a cost he'd recognized even then. She looked like someone who had slept, which was different, and like someone who had spent 3 days doing very hard work, which was probably accurate. You look tired, he said, sitting down. I am tired, she said. We rescheduled the Meridian announcement for next Friday. I've been in legal and regulatory meetings since Wednesday morning. She picked up her coffee. Gregor Sue's attorneys filed a motion yesterday attempting to suppress the communication logs from the server room. They argued improper extraction. A slight pause. My legal team spent 6 hours explaining why they're wrong, which they are. She set the coffee down. How's your shoulder? He looked at her. My shoulder. The way you were favoring your right side on Keller Street, I noticed. It's fine, he said. Sore. You should have someone look at it. It'll work itself out. She held his gaze for a moment with an expression that suggested she had opinions about that approach to medical care and was choosing to keep them to herself for now. Then she said, I want to ask you what I said I was going to ask. Okay, he said, not the full history. That's not what this is. She seemed to be choosing words with more care than usual, which for her was saying something. I just need to understand who was in that building with me, because I've thought about it for 3 days, and I still can't reconcile the man who fixes water lines on 14 with what I watched you do on 37. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the restaurant window, Lincoln Park in November was doing its gray and patient thing. Joggers and dog walkers moving along the paths with their shoulders up against the cold. 11 years Army, he said. Special Forces. The last 4 years were the work that doesn't have clear titles in the paperwork. Small teams, specific objectives, places where the situations were complicated and the rules were negotiated. He paused. I left 3 years ago. I came to Chicago for Emma. She needed something stable, and I needed... He stopped, searching for the word that was actually true. I needed to stop being someone whose job required me to be ready for what happened in your building. Vivian listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been, and which he noticed. You didn't stop being ready, she said. No, he said. I stopped being deployed. That's different. She turned her coffee cup slowly on the table, a small rotation, thinking. Does Emma know? She knows I was in the army. She knows it was a long time and that it took me to hard places. He paused. She's 11. She knows more than I give her credit for, and I know that. But she doesn't need the specifics yet. When will she need them? I'll know when she asks the right questions. Vivian nodded slowly. Then she said, My security director is resigning. Not because of what happened, he's been planning it for a year. It's personal reasons. But the timing means I have a vacancy at the head of my entire security division. She let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. I want to offer you the position. He'd half expected it. He looked at her directly. I'm a maintenance contractor. You were a special forces operative who outmaneuvered a professional team inside a 42-floor building in the dark while simultaneously evacuating civilians and securing critical evidence. She said it straightforwardly, not as flattery. You don't need me to explain why I'm sitting here asking you this. I know why you're asking, he said. I'm not sure I'm the right answer. Why not? He thought about how to say it. The person I was in that building. I've spent 3 years putting distance between myself and that person. Not because I'm ashamed of him, because I promised Emma a father who came home from work and told her about water pipes and HVAC systems, and whether the cable car he'd ridden on the job was actually as old as the building inspector said it was. He paused. I don't know if I can be the head of your security division and still be that father. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Outside, a woman walked past the window with a dog that was considerably too large for the leash she was using and was managing it anyway through some combination of will and negotiation. Can I tell you what I observed? Vivian said. Go ahead. In that building, you made 12 separate decisions that I've been able to reconstruct. I've thought about each one. Not one of them was reckless. Not one of them put any of us, including yourself, at unnecessary risk. Every single one was proportionate, precise, and informed by a clear hierarchy of what mattered. She paused. The first thing you did when you recognized the situation wasn't to engage. It was to move employees to safety. The last thing you did before we left the server room was check that the door was properly closed. She looked at him. That's not the behavior of someone who wants to fight. That's the behavior of someone who wants everyone to go home. He said nothing. That's also what I need in a security director, she said. Not someone who's looking for opportunities to use what they know. Someone who's trying to make sure those opportunities don't arise in the first place. She paused. And when they do arise, someone who can handle them without falling apart or overcorrecting. Mason looked at his own coffee cup. He thought about Emma. He thought about the recital on Thursday, which he had not missed, which he had sat in the third row for in clothes that didn't have grease stains, watching his daughter's left hand move through the third section with a steadiness that hadn't been there at practice, and feeling something so uncomplicated and enormous that he hadn't had room for any of the last week's wait while it was happening. He thought about the junction box at 5:30, and the fact that he'd found it not because he'd been looking for it, but because 8 months of learning a building had put him in the right place at the right moment to see something wrong. And then he thought about what Vivian had just said, someone who's trying to make sure those opportunities don't arise in the first place. I'd need certain things, he said. Something in Vivian's expression shifted, controlled, but he saw it. She'd read his tone and understood that this was not a refusal. Tell me what you need, she said. Hours that let me take Emma to school and be home for dinner most nights. Not every night. I understand what the job means, but most nights. He paused. A team I can actually build. Not inherited infrastructure I have to work around. If I'm responsible for your security, I need to be responsible for the people delivering it. Agreed, she said, and I need 6 weeks. To close my current contracts properly, to transition my clients, and to... He paused. I need time to explain to Emma what's changing and why. 6 weeks, she said. That works with the transition timeline. And one more thing. He looked at her directly. I'm not going to be someone who works for you the way Marcus Webb worked for you. I'll disagree with you when I think you're wrong. About security decisions, about risk assessment, about judgment calls that involve the safety of people in your organization. If you want someone who agrees with you, I'm not the right answer. Vivian looked at him for a moment. Then something moved across her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood, private and real, the kind of expression that doesn't show up for audiences. That is specifically why I'm asking you, she said. He looked at his coffee. He thought about Emma's left hand in the third section, steady where it hadn't been before. He thought about Mrs. Garza's kitchen light in the window at 12:53. He thought about the way the morning after the worst night in recent memory could still smell like butter and coffee and a small person demanding potatoes, and how that smell was the most reliable compass he'd found in 3 years of trying to navigate by something he could trust. I'll need to talk to Emma first, he said. Of course. And she'll have questions? She sounds like someone who usually does. She is, he said. There was something in his voice that he didn't try to control. She's the most relentlessly honest person I know, and she's 11 years old, and I have absolutely no idea what I'm going to do when she's 17. Vivian smiled then, a real one, short and sudden, like it had gotten out before she'd decided whether to let it. I imagine you'll figure it out, she said. You seem to figure most things out. I make it up as I go, he said. I'm just quiet about it. She looked at him for a moment. Most people can't tell the difference, she said, between making it up and knowing what you're doing. No, he agreed. They can't. The lunch arrived. He'd ordered without quite noticing, the way you do when a conversation has taken up all the room, and they ate and talked. And the conversation moved into the practical and the specific, what the security division currently looked like, what the gaps were, what the Sult situation meant for the company's exposure in the short term. Vivian talked about the Meridian deal with the focused energy of someone who had been through something that should have destroyed a thing she'd built and was instead more certain than ever that the thing deserved to be built. There was something in that certainty that wasn't arrogance. It had been tested too recently for arrogance. But that was close to conviction, which was different and, in Mason's experience, rarer. At some point during the second coffee, she said, Daniel asked me about you this morning. He wanted to know if I was in contact with you. What did you tell him? That we were having lunch. She paused. He said to tell you that he's never been in a utility shaft before and that it was the single worst 40 feet of his life and that he's grateful. Mason looked at the table. He kept it together in there. That matters. He also said, she hesitated slightly, that he thought Emma sounded like a good kid from the call he overheard in the stairwell. Mason absorbed that. The stairwell call at the 22nd floor landing when he'd checked on her before the group knew how the next 30 minutes would go. He hadn't known who was listening. She is, he said. She's a very good kid. He paused. She's also going to tell me the potatoes this morning weren't as good as last week's, and she'll be right, because I overcooked them slightly. So, Vivian looked at him with an expression that was simultaneously amused and something more than amused, something more considered, like she was filing something away about him that she thought might be important later. So, she agreed. Outside, the November afternoon was doing what November in Chicago does, darkening earlier than you expect it to, the light going from gray to amber to something close to gone in the space of what feels like 20 minutes. The restaurant was filling up around them, lunchtime becoming early evening, the ordinary churn of a city that had no idea about the 42nd floor of a glass building 3 days ago and was going about its business accordingly. Mason Reid sat across from Vivian Holloway in a corner table in Lincoln Park, and his shoulder ached and his coffee was getting cold. And somewhere across the city, Emma was at school doing something with fractions that she'd texted him about earlier and that he'd promised to help with tonight. And the particular shape of all of that, the ache and the cold coffee and the fractions, was more solid and real to him than anything he'd felt in a long time. Not fixed, not resolved, not the clean arrived feeling of someone who'd figured out where they were going and gotten there. Just present. Here. In a city he'd chosen, with a kid who demanded potatoes and texted suspicious emojis and stayed up past midnight to make sure he came home. With work that had just shown him, in the most direct possible terms, that the things he'd carried for 11 years hadn't stopped being part of him and probably weren't going to. and that maybe the question wasn't how to put them down, but how to carry them in a way that was useful instead of just heavy. He picked up his coffee and drank it cold, because it was there. And cold coffee was still coffee, and some things you just accept about the day you're having. Vivian was looking at something on her phone, a message from her legal team, from the tightening around her eyes, and he watched her shift back into CEO mode with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it for 20 years, the private expression closing over, the professional one taking its place, the weight of an empire settling back onto her shoulders like a coat she'd briefly taken off. She was not a simple person. He hadn't expected her to be. He was not a simple person either, and he'd spent 3 years pretending otherwise, and it hadn't worked. And the evidence was sitting in a formal police report in Karen Osei's filing system and on the news cycle that had been running his name through its machinery for 3 days, and in the expression on Emma's face when she'd looked at his torn jacket in the dark of their living room and said, "You don't look fine." He wasn't fine. He was something more complicated than fine, and maybe that was okay. Maybe that was actually what he had to work with. Vivian put down her phone. "I need to go," she said. "Legal is calling in 10 minutes. She looked at him steadily across the table. "Think about what I said." "I will," he said. "And Mason." She stood, pulling on her coat, and the CEO was fully back now, composed and direct, and moving toward the next thing with the particular momentum of a person who always has a next thing. But there was something underneath it, something that had been in her voice since the bus shelter, since I told you I'd ask, and that's not actually your call. Something that wasn't about the job offer, or the security division, or the Meridian deal, or Gregor Sue. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did in there." He looked at her. "I was in the building anyway," he said. She gave him the look that deserved. "Yes," she said. "You were." And she left, and the door closed behind her, and Mason sat at the corner table alone with his cold coffee and the restaurant noise around him and the amber November light going dark outside the window. His phone buzzed. "Emma. Emma, can you pick me up today instead of bus?" He looked at it. He thought about the 6 weeks he'd asked for. He thought about what it would mean to Emma and what it would mean to him, and what it would mean to the particular promise he'd made to himself 3 years ago in a different city when he'd chosen Chicago and a maintenance contract and a quiet life as the destination. He thought about quiet, about how quiet had served him and where it had fallen short, and what the difference was between a man who was quiet because he was at peace and a man who was quiet because he was hiding, and whether those two men were as different as he'd spent 3 years telling himself they were. He typed back, "Mason. Yeah, I'll be there at 3. Emma. Okay, also the fractions are stupid. Mason. They're not stupid, they're just fractions. Emma. Same thing. Put the phone in his pocket and finished the cold coffee and left a tip that was more than the bill, because he was that kind of tired. The kind where generosity is easier than accounting. And he put on his jacket and walked out into the amber November afternoon and stood on the Lincoln Park sidewalk for a moment, breathing the cold air of a city that had been his home for 3 years, and that he was, for the first time, beginning to think might stay that way. Not fixed, not certain, not the clean, resolved version of a man who'd figured it out. Just a man who'd shown up when it mattered, who had a kid to pick up at 3, and who had 6 weeks to decide what came next. He started walking toward his car. The fractions took 45 minutes. Not because Emma couldn't do them. She could, and she did, eventually, with the particular expression of someone who has decided to understand something through sheer refusal to let it beat her. But she had questions about why they worked the way they did, not just how. And Mason had learned early on that answering the how without the why was a good way to get her to stop listening. So they sat at the kitchen table for 45 minutes with a notebook between them and worked through it together until the why made sense, and she could see the shape of it rather than just the steps. "Okay," she said finally, closing the notebook with the finality of a verdict. "I still think they're stupid, but I understand them now." "That's usually how it goes," he said. She looked at him across the table. She'd been doing that more than usual in the past 3 days, looking at him with the evaluating attention of someone who was trying to measure a change she could sense but hadn't been told about yet. He'd noticed it and had been waiting for the moment she decided to say something, because with Emma, the moment always came. "Are you going to tell me what happened last week?" she asked. He'd made dinner, pasta, simple, the weeknight kind, And the plates were still on the table, and the kitchen smelled like garlic, and the particular warmth of a small apartment in winter. He looked at her for a moment, at this 11-year-old person sitting across from him in a school sweatshirt with a pencil still tucked behind her ear, and he decided that the moment had, in fact, come. "Yeah," he said. "I am." So he told her, not the full operational version he'd given Karen Osei, and not the carefully edited version he'd been holding in reserve for a parental conversation he'd been dreading. Something in between, honest, complete enough, stripped of the parts that were more about his own processing than about what she needed to know. He told her about the junction box, about the lights going out, about moving people to safety and finding Vivian in the dark in the server room on 37. He didn't use clinical language or action movie language. He used the language he'd use if he were telling her about a bad day at work that had been more complicated than expected, because that was the closest honest framework he had for it. Emma listened without interrupting. That was unusual. She was a person who interrupted regularly and without apology, and the fact that she didn't now told him how seriously she was taking what he was saying. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Were you scared?" she asked. He thought about that. The real answer, not the reflex answer. "Not during," he said. "After. When I was on the sidewalk and I checked my phone and saw your messages." He paused. "That scared me." She considered that. "Because you were worried about me, or because you felt bad about being late?" "Both," he said. "Mostly the first one." She nodded slowly, processing. "Then, the stuff you know how to do, the things you did in the building." She was choosing her words with an unusual care. "That's from when you were in the army." "Yes." "The part you don't really talk about." "Yes." She looked at the table, then back at him. "Are you in trouble? Like, legally, because of what you did?" "No," he said. "I cooperated with the police fully. What I did was legal. I was protecting people." "Okay." Another pause. "Are you going to keep doing maintenance work?" And there it was. He should have known she'd get there without him leading her. He looked at her directly because she deserved that. "Someone offered me a different job," he said. "Head of security for a company, the company where this happened." Emma looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw did the tight thing, the thing she'd inherited from him that neither of them had ever named out loud. "Is it dangerous?" "It could be sometimes. Less than what happened last week. More than fixing water lines." He paused. "I haven't said yes yet. I wanted to talk to you first. To ask me. To tell you. And to hear what you think." She turned her pencil over in her fingers, the one from behind her ear, and looked at it. "If you take it, does that mean—" She stopped, recalibrating. "Does it mean you go back to being that person? The one from before?" He understood what she was asking, not about the job title or the hours. She was asking whether Chicago, whether the 3 years of water pipes and school pickups and weekend breakfasts, whether all of that had just been a detour back to something that was always going to reclaim him. "No," he said. And then, because she was 11 and had inherited his ability to detect halfway answers, "I don't think so. I think—" He paused. "I think I spent 3 years trying to be a completely different person, and what happened last week showed me that doesn't actually work. The things I know, the way I was trained, those don't go away. But they don't have to mean what they used to mean. I can use them to protect people without it becoming—" He searched for the word. "Without it consuming everything." Emma was quiet. "I hope that's true," she said finally. Not as a challenge. As something more honest than a challenge. As a statement of what mattered to her, clear and direct, the way she'd always been with him, even when it would have been easier not to be. "So do I," he said, which was the right answer, the only true one. She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up her fork and started eating the pasta that had gone slightly cold, and she said, "Your new boss, the CEO from the building, is she the one who was in the news?" "Yes." She looked intense in the photos. "She is intense," he said. "Do you like her?" He thought about that in the specific way the question required. "I respect her," he said. "She kept her head in a bad situation. She made good decisions under pressure." He paused. and she didn't pretend any of it was easy afterward, which a lot of people do. Emma seemed to weigh that. "Okay," she said, "I think you should take the job." He looked at her. "But," she said, holding up the fork, "you have to actually be home for dinner. Not most nights. Like, genuinely most nights. And Thursdays are school things. No exceptions." And she was ticking these off with the methodical precision of someone who had been thinking about contingencies. "You tell me the truth about what's happening with work. Not everything. I'm not stupid. I know some things are private. But when something like last week happens, you tell me. You don't let me find out on the news." He looked at his daughter, this person who had been 3 years old when he'd first held her, and 8 when her mother left, and 9 when he'd moved them both to Chicago with 2 suitcases and a maintenance contract and the very specific promise that things were going to be quieter now. This person who had learned fractions under protest tonight, and who stayed up past midnight to make sure he came home. "Deal," he said. She nodded once, satisfied, and went back to eating. "Also," she said, through a mouthful of pasta, "I want a dog." "That is completely unrelated. It's been on the table for 2 years. The table is for things I've agreed to consider." "You agreed to consider it." "I'm still considering." She gave him the narrowed eye emoji in real life, which was an impressive thing to do with a human face. He picked up his fork and ate, and the kitchen was warm and the pasta was slightly cold. And outside the window, Chicago was doing its November thing, and none of it was fixed or resolved or tied up cleanly, because nothing real was, ever. And he was beginning to understand that clean resolution was not actually what he'd been looking for all along. What he'd been looking for was this: dinner, fractions, a kid who negotiated with him, the ongoing, imperfect, complicated work of staying. Once. 6 weeks later, he started the job. The official title was Director of Corporate Security, Holloway Corporation. The office was on the 31st floor. He'd specifically requested below 35, which Vivian had understood without asking him to explain it, which told him something about how she processed information. The team he inherited had 8 people, 4 of whom were worth keeping, 2 of whom were technically competent but fundamentally misaligned in their approach to the work, and 2 who had been in their positions so long they'd calcified around the assumptions of a security infrastructure that no longer matched the company's actual risk profile. He spent the first 2 weeks doing assessments, and the 3rd week having honest conversations that were not, in every case, comfortable. The 2 calcified ones left. He didn't enjoy that. He didn't pretend he did. He brought in 3 new people over the following month. One was a former FBI analyst named Rourke, who had an attention to detail that bordered on compulsive, and who Mason suspected would eventually drive everyone slightly crazy, including himself, and who was exactly the kind of person he needed on threat assessment. One was a woman named Iris Chen, who had spent 8 years in private corporate security and who understood institutional politics well enough to see threats that didn't look like threats until they were, which was most of the relevant kind. The 3rd was a kid named Torres, 26, former Army, who had something Mason recognized: the discipline of someone who'd been in the field and the specific hunger of someone who was trying to figure out what that meant in civilian life. He kept an eye on Torres, not because he was a risk, because he reminded Mason of himself at that age, which was a complicated mirror to hold. The work was different from what he'd done before Chicago. Not easier. Different. The threats he was managing were financial and reputational and structural, the kind that wore suits and filed legal motions and sent carefully worded emails rather than cutting power on the 40th floor. Some of them were more dangerous than anything he'd faced in that building, in the way that slow-moving threats are always more dangerous than acute ones, because acute ones at least announce themselves. He was, he discovered, good at this version of the work. Not because of what he'd done in the field, though that informed it. Because he'd spent 8 months learning a building from the inside out by being the person everyone looked past, and that perspective, the view from the maintenance corridor, the blind spots in other people's awareness, turned out to be exactly the lens a security director needed, and almost none of them had. Vivian noticed. She didn't say it directly, which he was learning was her style. She expressed assessment through the caliber of problems she brought to him, escalating the complexity and sensitivity of what she asked him to weigh in on as his judgment proved sound. It was, in its way, the most demanding form of compliment he'd ever received. They developed a working relationship that was direct and occasionally argumentative, and, he thought, honest in the specific way that two people who had been through something real together could be honest without much preamble. She disagreed with him twice in the first month on risk assessments, and was right once and wrong once. And when she was wrong, she said so without theater, which he respected more than almost anything else he observed about her. "You were right about the vendor contract review," she said, one afternoon in late January, when the audit he'd pushed for had turned up a secondary vulnerability in their building access systems that predated the Sue situation. "I pushed back too hard on the timeline. You had the Meridian launch," he said. "The timing pressure was real." "The timing pressure was real, and you were still right." She looked at him across the table in her office. "I'm not good at being wrong. I'm working on it." "I know," he said. "You're better at it than you think." She looked at him with the expression that appeared occasionally when he said something she hadn't expected, something that caught the edge of something more personal than the work. Then it was gone, and she was back to the audit report, and the conversation moved forward. He drove to school pickup at 3:15 on Thursdays. He made dinner most nights, not every night, and on the nights he didn't make it, he called before 7, and Emma answered with either acceptance or the specific tone that told him she was keeping score, and he preferred the second one because it meant she was paying attention, and a kid who pays attention is a kid who's engaged in the ongoing negotiation of being alive with the people around her. She got the dog in March, a 3-year-old rescue named Carl, who was medium-sized and had an underbite, and was, according to Emma, the most emotionally intelligent being in the apartment, which Mason felt was accurate and didn't argue with. Gregor Suit's trial began in April. It took 6 weeks of testimony and 3 weeks of deliberation, and Mason was called to the stand on the 4th day for direct and cross-examination that lasted most of the morning. He sat in the witness box in a suit he'd bought for the occasion. Charcoal, nothing flashy, the kind of clothes that said, "I am here to be taken seriously rather than I am here to be noticed." And he answered questions in the same even, precise way he'd answered Karen Ossie on Keller Street, the same way he'd answered the detectives in the formal interview, the way he answered everything that deserved to be answered seriously, which was by being completely factual and refusing to perform the emotion that other people expected him to display. Sue's defense attorney spent 40 minutes trying to reframe Mason's actions as reckless and his background as inherently suspicious. Mason answered every question calmly and completely and watched the attorney's strategy slowly realize it wasn't working in real time, which was the kind of thing that, in other circumstances, he might have found almost interesting. Vivian testified the following day. He watched from the gallery. She was, as he had expected, extraordinarily composed. Not cold, not robotic, but controlled in the way of someone who has prepared for this and understands that precision matters more than emotion when the stakes are this high. She walked the court through the server room evidence, the communication logs, the wire transfers, the 4 months of documented coordination between Marcus Webb and Gregor Sau, with the measured clarity of someone who had been building this case in her own mind since the night it happened and was now simply presenting a structure she'd already constructed. Marcus Webb testified under a cooperation agreement. He was not composed. He was a man who had made a choice and was now living in full public view of what that choice had been. And whatever Mason thought about what Marcus had done, the witnessing of that was not satisfying. It was just what it was, a person carrying the weight of a bad decision in a room full of other people, which is one of the more specifically uncomfortable things a human being can be called to do. Salt was convicted on 8 counts, including corporate espionage, conspiracy, and coordinated criminal trespass. The sentencing was 7 years with potential for parole at 4. His attorneys announced an appeal within the hour, which surprised nobody. Vivian called Mason from outside the courthouse. He was in his office, which had a window that faced south, and from which he could not see the courthouse, but could see the gray spring sky above the city, which was finally beginning to suggest that the gray might not last. "Guilty on all 8, she said. "I know. I was watching." A brief pause. "How are you feeling about it?" He thought about that honestly. "Relieved that it's done. Not particularly satisfied. That's usually how these things land." "Yes," she said. He could hear the outside air in the call, the city sounds around her. "I thought I'd feel more finished than this." "You're not finished," he said. "The appeal will run for at least a year, and there's still the civil side." "I know." She paused again. I mean, finished in the other sense. The part where you think getting to the verdict is going to resolve something internal and then it doesn't quite. He understood that. He'd experienced it before, in different contexts, the gap between the event ending and the ending actually arriving. Give it time, he said, which was not particularly sophisticated advice, but was the true advice, and he'd made a habit of those being the same thing. How's Emma? She asked. He looked at the south-facing window. She has a dog now. His name is Carl. Carl. She named him. I had no input. I like it, she said. He could hear something in her voice that was lighter than it had been a minute ago, which was probably the point of asking if he was being honest with himself. Tell her I said good name. She'll be insufferably pleased about that. Good, Vivian said. She should be. She was quiet for a moment. He waited, because he'd learned over the past several months that Vivian's silences usually contained something that was working its way to the surface, and interrupting them was a waste of whatever was coming. Mason, she said. Yeah. I want to say something, and I need you to not deflect it. He paused. Okay. What you did in that building, not just the tactical stuff, not the stairwells and the server room and the 37th floor, the other part, the way you kept your head when everything that was supposed to be protecting me had already failed. She paused. I've been running this company for 20 years. I've worked with people who are very good at their jobs, but what you did in that building, she stopped. You gave me the chance to fight back. That's what I remember. Not that you protected me, that you made sure I could protect myself. He sat with that for a moment. It was a more precise thing than thank you, and it landed more precisely. That's the job, he said. But he said it quietly, not as a deflection, as the thing he actually believed. Yes, she said, it is. And she meant his job now, he understood. Not just the night in the building, the ongoing work of being the person who made sure other people had the space to do what they needed to do. I'll see you Monday, she said. Monday, he agreed. She hung up. He sat in his office with the south-facing window and the gray spring sky, and Carl was at home with Emma and Mrs. Garza, and dinner was going to be whatever Emma decided since it was her turn this week. A concession he'd made in February that had produced 3 reasonable meals and 1 experimental disaster involving canned tuna that they didn't speak of. And the city was doing what it always did, which was going on, indifferent and enormous and full of the ordinary weight of ordinary days. He thought about what Vivian had said. Not that you protected me, that you made sure I could protect herself. He'd spent 11 years being the person who went through the door first so that other people didn't have to. He'd been good at it. He'd believed in it. And then he'd spent 3 years trying to be the person who fixed water lines and made eggs and helped with fractions. And he'd believed in that too. And somewhere in the space between the 40th floor going dark and the Lincoln Park corner table and the 6 weeks in the 31st floor office, he'd begun to understand something he hadn't had language for before. The two things were not opposites. They were not a before and after. They were not 2 different versions of himself that he had to choose between. He was a man who knew how to protect people, and he was a man who made eggs and argued about dogs and helped an 11-year-old understand why fractions worked the way they did. And those 2 things lived in the same body without contradiction, because both of them came from the same place. The specific and unglamorous belief that the people around you were worth the effort of showing up for every day, in whatever form that took. That wasn't a revelation. It wasn't a clean, arrived understanding that changed everything. It was just a thing he knew now, the way you know things that have been true for a long time and that you've finally stopped arguing with. He picked up his phone and texted Emma. Mason, what are we doing for dinner? The response came in 30 seconds. Emma, I'm thinking pasta. Mason, we had pasta last week. Emma, it was good though. Mason, fair point. Emma, also Carl ate my homework. Mason, dogs don't eat homework. Emma, this one does. He's special. Mason, is the homework okay? Emma, define okay. He looked at the message and thought about the fractions and the recital and the torn jacket in the hallway and the bus shelter bench and Keller Street in November and the cold coffee at the Lincoln Park restaurant and 6 weeks of decisions that had led to a 31st floor office with a south-facing window. and he thought that whatever okay meant, he was somewhere in its general direction for the first time in a long time. Mason, I'll be home by 6. Emma, bring something for Carl Mason. Carl has food. Emma, he likes variety. Mason, Carl is a dog. Emma, a special dog, Dad. Keep up. He put the phone in his pocket and turned back to his desk, where the vendor contract audit was waiting, and the Meridian Expansion's new security protocol needed his final review before end of week, and the ordinary ongoing work of Tuesday afternoon was asking for his attention. He gave it. Outside, the gray sky over Chicago held its position, the way gray skies do. Not promising anything, not withholding anything, just present above a city full of people doing the imperfect, unfinished, necessary work of their lives. The kind of sky you learn to be okay with after enough seasons, because waiting for the clear days to do your living is a way of not living at all. Mason Reid was not waiting anymore. He was already here,